This is the DP Show,
where insanity sounds sane.
And now, the man, the myth, the legend in his own mind, D. Palmer.
It's an extended DP Show. I'm D. Palmer. Got a big story that popped up over the weekend. This is our first chance to talk with you about it, and I'm going to take full advantage as we got a long time to talk to one another. And to introduce it, I'm going to go back to the mid-'90s days of yore, the hit television program Seinfeld, and how Jerry Seinfeld introduced that topic that they were going to be covering over that episode. And in interest of all of our different listeners and potential advertisers, I am going to spare you my Seinfeld impression. You're welcome for that, by the way, as I will just read to you this joke in my normal voice. It goes like this. Loyalty to any one sports team is pretty hard to justify. The players are always changing, the teams move to another city. You're actually rooting for the clothes when you get right down to it. You are standing and cheering and yelling for your clothes to beat the clothes from another city. Fans can be in love with a player, but if he goes to another team, they boo him. This is the same human being in a different shirt. They hate him now. Boo! Different shirt. Boo. That's Seinfeld, as read by D.S. Palmer. Pretty good stuff, if you ask me, because especially now, we are in the face of this being American politics. As I've been making the claim now, ever since the DP show got off the mat, that you have Republicans, you have Democrats, you have the same thing. And what we are now enjoying, if you are on one side of the aisle, or chuckling about if you're on another, is the announcement from Mitt Romney, alleged conservative, that he has named Paul Ryan, the great conservative, according to some circles, as his running mate. Or they are going up against the great spender in one circle, or the preserver of humanity in another, Barack Obama. What I've been trying to tell you guys is that this is the same human being, just in a different shirt. One shirt's blue, the other shirt's red. Challengers are wearing red this time. And this is just the most recent, if not best, illustration of such a thing, as Paul Ryan, now going to be operating as Mitt Romney's vice presidential candidate, has been celebrated as this great fiscal conservative, that, as it has been illustrated by the Ryan budget, the pathway to prosperity. There's nothing fiscal about this budget. It is just butt-naked partisan politics, as we are going to discuss here. This is just a continuation of the whole Mitt Romney campaign. Romney insists that under a Barack Obama administration, that American prosperity has dwindled and disappeared. And his answer to this is to go back to 2008 spending levels. Or in other words, prosperity was running rampant when George W. Bush and his budgets were ruling the day. Even though, according to any traditional rule of conservatism, George W. Bush was nothing but a rampant spender in his own right. He was no conservative. His governments were the largest in the history of the country. I've talked about before how his proposed governments, when he was running for president in 2000, would have been the biggest the country had ever seen. This is not conservatism. And either they think we're stupid, or they actually are, if they believe that they are, in any sense of the word, being conservative. Right? They either believe that they can do whatever they want, and we're just not going to notice, which sadly is probably the case, or they have no concept what conservatism is. Because by my count, there are three potential definitions, or three different qualifiers that would make one conservative. You have spending, you have defense, and you have American tradition. Or in other words, you are trying to conserve the amount of spending that is going out, you are trying to conserve the level of defense that you feel you have attained, or you are trying to conserve what you feel your country, in this case the United States of America, has always been about. Let's take a quick look and break these down just a little bit. For example, with spending. If this was something that was ordinarily going to be done in the private sector, that person would be known as cheap. I know this because I've been called that repeatedly by many different people. If somebody is trying to conserve the amount of wealth they've been able to bring into a household, they are not spending a lot. They are viewed as being alligator armed, if you will, because they can't quite reach their wallet, or they're cheap. Historically, if you want to look at this, it has been the resistance towards centralized spending. whether that be in the form of railroad grants. It is our job to try to best populate this continent, to try to zigzag railroads across it. And the only way you can do that, the only way you can pursue such an expensive endeavor, is to have the government write checks to these guys so they can then go build railroads. Some people said there's got to be a better way to do that, conserving, because they didn't want to spend that much money. Or if you were against debasing currency to try to make farmers happy toward the latter part of the 19th century. Farmers always said, I don't have gold, I don't have wealth, I don't have enough money to try to do things like grow food. So politicians would try to rally around them, gain popularity, by saying, I'm going to give the farmers more money, which meant making more money, which meant debasing the currency. And there were people who thought that you shouldn't do that. Generally, those people were conservative. Fast forward to the more modern times, and FDR was able to Shanghai the progressive movement. Suddenly being a progressive meant all sorts of governmental programs. If you resisted those because in part of spending, but also philosophically, you think that there's a better way to try to jumpstart the economy, maybe with the private sector, then you're generally conservative. And then go over to LBJ, and if you don't think that the government should be responsible for taking care of the poor, the needy, the sick, and all that stuff, generally because of spending again, philosophically because you think the private sector is more equipped, you could be considered conservative. Or in short, if you don't want centralized governmental spending, you are generally conservative. Or another way to look at this is if you don't want to have a large government as a result of all that spending, then you are conservative. Okay? The question then becomes, when was the last time we had that sort of thing to discuss? Because if you go all the way back past World War II, you're going to be talking about how there have not been any truly conservative governments. Governmental spending has been running amok. And Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, as I will illustrate, citing a few of my friends, at least I would love to consider them friends, to show that Paul Ryan, this great fiscal conservative, is nothing of the sort. And Mitt Romney, by saying that all we need to do is go back to 2008 spending, is not conservative. That is spending. Spend, spend, spend. Not conserving. By conserving, you don't spend. In 2008, no government in the history of the United States of America had been that large. And that was the case even right after Bill Clinton, the great liberal, left office. So Mitt Romney saying we're going to reduce governmental spending back to 2008 is not conservative. Furthermore, let's go over to defense. The reason that we have to continue, according to many circles, to expand, which right away that seems anti-conservative, is because we're meeting all sorts of different threats. Traditionally, back when there were real conservatives, it was understood that the United States of America was blessed because it was so remote. It was isolated by two different oceans, one on each side. It's hard, even in our current technological times, to try to penetrate those barriers and threaten a people because of those different oceans. So a real conservative would get back and say, look, if we need to recognize that we have these great natural barriers that are providing a lot of defense. There's no reason to go out there and continue expanding, which again I would argue is anti-conservative. If you want to go back over to World War II, as so many people do, well, you just don't understand the threat that Hitler posed. Let me just dismiss this immediately. Hitler posed no threat to the United States of America. I know that because he posed very little threat to the British Isles, which he could not cross the English Channel to invade. That's why the Battle of Britain was fought in the air. He couldn't go over a short waterway, I beg your pardon, to try to invade one potential enemy or ally of the Americans. How is he going to go across one giant waterway, the Atlantic Ocean, to try to threaten the United States? Or you go, okay, well, how about Japan? Try to argue that one. Well, Herbert Hoover has recently had a book published, former President Herbert Hoover, where he criticizes FDR for, in part, getting out there and doing just enough to threaten the Japanese, economically in particular, to force them to have no choice but to fly over to Hawaii and drag the United States into World War II. All right? Again, if we were minding our own business and just keeping our strengths, to our strengths, I should say, meaning recognizing the great benefits that we have, there would have been no threat. And this has been the case, really, ever since the United States expanded from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Go back and look at exactly what kind of foreign military threat the United States has faced since it dispatched the Mexicans in the Mexican-American War. But furthermore, even if you insist that there have been threats that needed to be met, if you want to run up this huge military budget to try to continue to pursue them, that you can't then consider yourself fiscally conservative because there is so much cost that goes into that. And the argument right now is that the governmental spending, as far as defense goes, as far as it is budgeted, I should say, has been dwindling. We're going to try to dismiss that as we go on with this. But that doesn't necessarily excuse anything if a fraction of what the budget is being spent toward is defense, that excuses any amount of spending only because it's a small amount. If you're truly conservative, if you're truly trying to limit the amount of funds that is leaving an institution, then you'd have to look at everything and say, my gosh, are we not spending too much here? I don't think you can have this both ways. You can't necessarily consider yourself a conservative because you were trying to conserve the amount of defense or safety that you've been able to attain, while then spinning around and doing so much spending that you are essentially becoming anti-conservative because of all of the jeopardy that you are exposing yourself to because of your financial well-being or lack thereof. How are these two things jiving is one question that I'd like to have so many conservatives like Paul Ryan answer that. But furthermore, and my personal favorite, is what you're actually conserving is the strong American tradition and American values. Well, okay, these guys really need to go back to school, because most of these so-called conservatives claim to really revere the Founding Fathers and the original framework of the United States of America, the Constitution, and all that stuff. My favorite example of this is Glenn Beck, because he best illustrates the complete ignorance that this philosophy is operating under, where on his program, Glenn Beck is going to have still photos of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, maybe even a James Madison in there, right? And then you go onto his Twitter page, or his Twitter account, and he's got the Israeli flag right there on his picture. This does not operate in concert with one another. Okay? Because you go over to George Washington. When he's leaving office, he says, point blank, avoid foreign entanglements. Try to have good relationships with everybody. All right? George Washington, if he had a Twitter account, would not have any other nation's flag next to his picture. If anything, he would have the planet Earth, because what he was saying is we need to try to have good relationships with everybody. George Washington, founder or father of the country. Okay? That's what he is saying. How can you then go on to the exact opposite of that and have all these unspoken, if not unofficial, alliances that the United States is then said to need to adhere to for such dire reasons as you can't really say that, except if you say anything but that, you're an isolationist and you should be laughed out of any room. But how about let's go one step further. A letter that Thomas Jefferson had written to James Madison from France when the Constitution was being hammered out. He said in there the one thing that he thought definitely needed to be included was a Bill of Rights. You need to include this Bill of Rights because without that, you're basically leaving it up to whoever is in power to make sure that they are going to. I don't want to say protect, but I can't think of any other. They are going to make certain that everybody's natural liberties and rights are going to remain intact. I got out of that without saying protect. Thomas Jefferson told James Madison, include a Bill of Rights to make sure that everybody's liberties are going to be had. And in fact, you go all the way to the other end of the spectrum with the anti-federalists, the people who are fighting against the creation of this massive central government that almost immediately took hold. They were saying no Bill of Rights because their concern was if you promise to protect only those, we'll say 10 liberties, what if something else pops up? Are we going to have any guarantee that that is going to be also guaranteed and protected by the Constitution? Or in other words, you go back to the founding of the country. If you were a real conservative, you would be most interested, if this is one of your tenets of conservatism, protecting basic, fundamental, natural, civil liberties. But most conservatives get really angry when you start talking to them about civil liberties, the ACLU and all that stuff. What are you conserving then? What part of the American tradition are you conserving? If it isn't such things as the right to free speech, fair trial, property, so on and so forth along those lines. Because what my basic argument is, there are no conservatives. I feel like I am one of the great conservatives because I feel like we shouldn't be spending money and we should be leaving people alone, just like the founders of our country had gone on to insist. But most conservatives look at me like I'm some sort of nut job because I don't want to get all up in people's business, and I don't know what else. But if that is one of what you are claiming, that we need to go back and we need to, A, not spend, B, adhere to the whole American tradition, and no, you're wrong, because we should not be spending money on all sorts of other welfare programs. We should be spending that money on defense. If you don't agree with those things, then you're not a conservative. But the American tradition thing is one of the biggest ones that gets in the way, in my opinion, because how can you try to make this argument in any other way except for these people were concerned with individuals and liberties? If you really do believe that the Founding Fathers were on the right track, have to make that one of the most preeminent messages of your conservative thought. But that's not the case. That is not the case. And what is the case instead is that you have pretended conservatives who claim office by draping themselves on this cloak. I'll say counterfeit, because they're better than the alternative. Or one of my most favorite debates. Well, just imagine how much taxes you would have been paying under Bill Clinton. That's not why anybody was supporting George W. Bush, because it could have been a lot worse if a Democrat was elected. We thought we were getting a conservative. We are hoping now with this election that we are going to get a conservative. Instead, what we got is Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, who right after this break, I'm going to show you exactly how little conservative they are. Paul Ryan in particular. This guy did nothing to earn his reputation. And believe me, I'm not trying to bash conservatives as much as I'm trying to enlighten them, just to show that you guys are not being represented the way you think. And we're going to keep talking about that on the DP Show on iTalk 106.7 right after this.